welcome everybody to the event. This is an event co-sponsored by Cultural Survival and by my organisation, Foundation for Aboriginal and Islander Research Action, and is also being sponsored by the Australian Indigenous Communications Association, who are going to send a journalist across to talk about the work that they're doing on broadcasting of human rights as well. But at the last minute, the person couldn't come because of changes in jobs that were occurring. But I'm happy to introduce the discussions. We're motivated to have this side event because now the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been adopted. A lot of work lies ahead to see that rights are recognised, acknowledged and implemented. And a large part of that is whether people in the communities or even governments are aware of the Declaration on the Rights and have a way of approaching the issues that these rights address. A report already introduced in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues yesterday was pointing out that Indigenous communities around the world need to be empowered, need to have the capacity in order to take up the challenges of self-determination. A large part of that will rely upon information and awareness on these sorts of issues. Already a number of efforts have been made to have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples published into book or booklet form, and these are becoming more widely available. In some situations, these governments have themselves taken the step to make the publications, and I understand Guatemala has already published and into print the declaration. It's also the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights has published into publication, and so on, and these are being distributed. However, it is likely that print media is going to use major languages, and when it comes to publications or sending the declaration to communities in the more local languages and in formats that people can understand, that they don't necessarily understand the way in which the language is constructed at the United Nations level, that they are able to understand the rights. And this brings forward the brilliant opportunities of radio, even though in technology terms it's old technology, to broadcast on airwaves and people to listen on radio receivers. It is in fact a technology that is very, very accessible for local communities, and particularly for Indigenous communities. We will see examples of where the communities themselves decide to acquire the necessary level of equipment to broadcast, and that is done on a low budget, shoestring budget to broadcast, and similarly for people to be able to receive these communications. And if we look at the populations around the world, the Indigenous populations are mostly living below poverty line levels, that people have very little facilities to access even to things like electricity and so on, then we can start to see that the radio does start to come a little bit to the forefront and does have its values that can be used. Most especially, and when it's been communications is occurring at the local level, at the community level, it can occur in the local language. It can also occur using the local constructions and interpretations and visualizations of rights. It can occur using local dignitaries, officials, leaders, advocates, etc. To present forward, and also it can be presented in more culturally appropriate ways, that information may not necessarily be in the format of going through a document, but may be more in the format of experiences and reports and so on. So there's a lot of versatility and opportunity that comes forward in radio. In Australia, we have quite an advanced system of radio networks in Aboriginal communities. Australia is a vast continent. It's the only continent in the world. It doesn't have a large population. Overall, there's only 25 million people in Australia, and of that, 500,000 or 500,000 people are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And 75% or more of Australia is dry desert, arid areas, and the population levels are very sparse, and many of our people live now in local communities, mainly for the provision of services such as housing, water, schooling, and so on. Communities will range from around 200 people for the smaller communities up to about 3,000 people for the larger communities. So there's a need for being able to communicate across large distances and to be able to reach people in the most remote and difficult of localities. Approximately 30 years ago, we started broadcasting Aboriginal radios in Australia, and we relied then upon what was available in the radio broadcasting system, that is using existing radio technology, using existing radio laws and so on. So we simply applied for either airtime on existing community radios or applied for licenses to run full-time radio, which is Indigenous radio. And progressively it has become more and more developed with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander radio programs. An early part of that process was where we had specific training at the national level for people to be radio broadcast journalists, and those people were trained centrally but then sent back to their communities to help with the broadcast procedures. And separately, the government also provided a program where low-cost equipment, in some cases would just be a video player, a home video player, combined with some of the technology to broadcast that, would be placed into communities, often where they would break down because of lack of air conditioning. Dust would very quickly break down these equipments and so on. So we have gone through a process starting from the very basics up to what is now much more sophisticated, of where we have air-conditioned radio stations. They are run like fully operational radio stations using more modern technology, going from AM broadcast to FM broadcast, and even now starting to use computerised technology and satellite technology to be able to broadcast over large footprints of Australia from one particular location. I just mentioned very briefly there that this has also worked in conjunction with television. We have one Aboriginal television station in Australia. We started with one called Impaja TV, located right in the very centre of Australia, which used to broadcast throughout of most remote Australia, and that's now been overtaken by the National Indigenous TV service, which now has a footprint which reaches all over Australia. The most difficult requirement is that it can only be received through cable TV. So radio has played a very big role in that, and we have now over 130 remote broadcasting service units throughout Australia. We have 23 full-time Indigenous radio stations and 120 community radio stations. And these stations are connected by what we call the National Indigenous Radio Service, which is a central office which is involved in radio production and sharing of programming through the NIRS program, NIRS. So not only do community radios now have the capacity for local production and broadcasting, but they also have access to national programs to download to that. And I often go back from United Nations meetings and do interviews with the National Indigenous Radio Service programs, and so those things are being reached all throughout through the local communities. I won't say much more on the Australian situation, other than to say we probably have a model of good practice in Australia because of the level of sophistication that's involved, the extensive network. It is a completely national network, but it's based very much on local community controls and so on. And it would probably compare, I think, to anywhere else in the world. I know that other areas have good arrangements, but not probably as cohesively organised on a national basis as well. And we have an Australian Indigenous Communications Authority, which brings all of the management and policy issues on this media together into one place. That includes not only broadcasting and television, but print media, and also is looking to look at digitised media and communications, of which we'll give a little bit more information on there. So I think I'll pull up there. I've probably taken more than my share of time to allow you to go to the next stage. Thank you very much.